Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we explore the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time. In this, our fourth season, we're looking at Kenneth Branagh's 2011 film, Thor. I'm Matthew Fox from theethicalpanda.com.
And I'm Andy Nelson from the Next Reel Film Podcast.
And today we're talking about minute 106, which begins with Darcy looking for her taser and ends with a long shot through the cosmos as the credits roll. Joining us on the show today, we have Paul Hoppe, a.k.a. ZenMadman, who is a poker professional, writer, musician, martial artist, and has been a frequent guest and occasionally official co-host and generally unofficial co-host of the Superhero Ethics and Star Wars Universe podcast I run. Paul, I'm so glad to have you with us on this today.
It's good to be here.
It's funny, you and I have been talking about these things for literal decades now, but you know, on the show, often we want to kind of start off by getting people's kind of background. I don't really know this. What first got you into like comic books and superheroes and all that?
I don't remember. I remember being like Superman was my favorite superhero as a little kid. Like I had a Superman outfit that I wore to like school interviews when I was 5, and my barber was one of the village people's boyfriends and like did my hair with the little curl and the little S or whatever. And my parents both worked in film, so I was always very into film. I had comic books as a kid that just people gave me. I guess I was never like a comics collector really, but I had some that I'd gotten and was like, well, these might be valuable someday. So I held on to them for a long time. And then, the Batman movies. So I was more of a sort of DC, aficionado. And then when the MCU started coming out, well, I liked the X-Men movies and Blade as well. But when the MCU started coming out, they started making really good movies. And I actually think Thor was kind of the movie that sold me on the idea of the whole thing, because
interesting.
Iron Man was like, okay, Robert Downey Jr., he's fantastic. It was a great movie. And then I actually even liked Incredible Hulk. I know that's maybe a divisive one amongst some people.
I also more a fan of it than most people.
And I think Edward Norton's great. And then, here they made Thor and Captain America. And I was sort of like, I don't know how these are going to translate to kind of the modern day, cinema. And then I was like, oh, these are good movies. And it's all kind of coming together into something.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we're going to need to hear a lot more about that and your thoughts on this movie. And we're going to start with that right after this quick promo.
We would love for you to jump into the conversation and join us talking about Thor, the MCU, anything Marvel, comics, any of it. Join us over in our Discord community and get in on the conversation. You can learn more by going to truestory.fm/Marvel Movie Minute and click on the Discord link.
Okay, so I know, Paul, especially as someone whose parents were in the movie industry and who really loves so much about the movie industry, we're excited to have you on to talk about the credits, among other things, but we do get a few moments at the end of this movie. And it starts with, we've just kind of come back from all the things that were happening on Asgard, and we saw Thor and Heimdall talking, and now we're back in Smith Motors with as I've been calling them, the Scientists 3. And we start with Erik. Darcy is looking for her taser, and then perhaps most significantly, Erik asks Darcy if she has the SHIELD satellite codes, which it's a very quick throwaway line, but I think it's really significant because it shows just how much the dynamic between them and SHIELD has changed.
It is such an interesting little shift. Oh, and such a quick shift, too. I guess we're assuming it's later that day. There's nothing that tells us this is just later that night. It's just kind of our assumption. Because, Thor, we're intercutting between here and Asgard, and it just seems like it's all the same day. But, it could be a few days later. So they obviously have things working with SHIELD now, and now they're using their satellite codes to, presumably continue studying the stars and trying to figure out more about the cosmos. So I like the way that it is such a subtle thing, but there's that quick moment that we have where things are kind of coming together for all of them. And largely, it makes me really wish that they had figured out how to bring Jane into more of the films other than just the Thor films, because, it's great that we have Erik. I absolutely love Stellan Skarsgård and what he's brought into it. But, how cool would it have been if Jane had kind of been one of the scientists who has kind of continued working through a lot of this stuff as well.
Yeah, it does feel like S.H.I.E.L.D. here kind of, went from seeing, oh, these scientists might be a threat by understanding some things that are going on and then sharing it with people that we don't want them to being like, oh, they might be useful to us. Let's, absorb them into our organization kind of. And I totally agree with you, Andy, about Jane, where she kind of, there's like a throwaway line in the Avengers about her being off safe somewhere. But it's like, it feels like she could have been a much more integral part of the whole universe, because here, where she is someone who's discovering like everything about the cosmos, and it seems like that's a pretty big deal. And then they kind of, just sidelined her aside from Thor 2.
Well, especially because we'll get, one of the next things that happens is we hear, the voiceover as we're sort of watching what Heimdall is seeing. And Thor says, how is she? And Heimdall answers, she searches for you. And I just felt like, a lot of this movie was about how, yes, Jane is falling for Thor, but she's this very serious scientist. And like at first, she doesn't really care that this gorgeous person keeps showing up and she keeps hitting her with her car. Like she mostly is just interested in the science. And I don't know, having at the end it being, what she's doing. It's not that she's searching to develop her theories. She's not, and I'm sure all that's happening, but it being framed as she's searching for you, especially with something we saw in the deleted scene, which makes it even worse. I don't know, it kind of left a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth, because I don't love this idea of everything she's been studying is now down to, she had one good date, and now she's kind of like obsessively stalking that guy.
Yeah, and you're right about the deleted scene, which I suppose we should talk about as well. But I mean, it is so much that this sense of it's not she's searching for you. It's like, I mean, really, I like to think that Jane is, she now has proof that this is out there. And I mean, if she is searching for him just to like get that proof back, because we know the Bifrost is broken and that really was the Einstein-Rosen bridge that she had been seeing and looking for, and now it's gone. So she's searching for him, but really she's searching for, this evidence again. Like that would have probably resonated a little better. But you're right. It does make it seem like there's nothing for her anymore except for this lost love.
Yeah, I was pleased to see that there was at least one Idris Elba line in this minute, but because I mean I enjoy him and everything, but that line did rankle me as well. Like I wrote down, like, doesn't she search for like truth and scientific knowledge? Like she's been a scientist for years or decades, and she's known Thor for like a day or a couple days, and it's like, okay, I buy the romance between them, but I feel like this really undermines what's interesting and powerful about her character beyond that. And it kind of maybe foreshadows the fact that then they don't have her be an integral character going forward in the rest of the MCU and S.H.I.E.L.D. and all of that.
The one way I can kind of headcanon this to work, and I do think this is a headcanon because this is not the way the movie is framed, is like Heimdall is kind of like a crusty old uncle to Thor.
Right.
And he's kind of like, of course, you want to ask about her. So I kind of like, it's like, yeah, she's searching for you, boy. Don't worry. She's still in. Like, that's my hope. But yeah, no, I think it definitely is a bit of an undercutting there. So we see her look at her watch and smile. What I was trying to just remember if that's like an Easter egg or if there's been something about her watch before. Did either one of you catch like the significance of that moment?
I didn't.
I don't know if there is something significant. It's just the sense that, I mean, as kind of going back to the beginning of the film where, she had been timing these atmospheric disturbances to the minute, as she says, it should have happened. They've been like right on time. And so if anything, it's one of those nods to the beginning as kind of a circular reference saying, here she is, again, something is supposed to be happening. I mean, they're all racing to get out to go do something with these satellite codes. So maybe that's what it is. Like this is that exact moment and she's looking forward to it or something. But it seems very loose if that was the intention.
So the only last thing about this before we'll talk about the alternate ending and then get into the credits themselves. there's a moment where Thor then kind of also looks up and smiles, and he's sort of like looking out over the cosmos. And Andy, you pointed out in our notes that this kind of seems a lot like it's a very similar pose and look to what Odin was doing not long ago. Kind of Thor, kind of he's not king yet, but he's kind of starting to take on more of that mantle.
Yeah, I was wondering, but just because, I mean, it is such a profile shot, and that's exactly what we had with Odin just a few minutes ago when Thor, very melancholically walks out to stand next to his father, and they have that conversation as they look out over Asgard. We find Odin in that profile shot looking very kingly, and in this particular moment, we have Jane looking directly into the camera. I mean, she's pretty much breaking the fourth wall, staring right at us, almost as if it's like, was that Heimdall's eye view, and there's kind of a connection there. But then when we cut to Thor, it's a profile, and it seems like, if anything, to kind of really cinematically connect them, it would have been something where they were both looking straight into the camera. So the fact that Brana chose to do kind of a profile shot here, I'm like, well, maybe he was just referencing that kingly Odin shot that we just had, but I wasn't quite sure. It's a nice shot, but I wasn't sure how well it connected for me between the shot of Jane and him.
Yeah, to me, it feels sort of like just like the coda, or just the stamp on the end. Like, this is Thor, kind of, as completed the arc that he had in this movie.
Definitely. So let's just quickly talk about the deleted scene. And for those of you who haven't seen it, basically it starts again in S.H.I.E.L.D. Motors, but it's a much better lit S.H.I.E.L.D. Motors.
Smith Motors.
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah.
Might as well be S.H.I.E.L.D. Motors.
Right, now it's S.H.I.E.L.D. Motors.
Although this time Erik is like, there's a whole bunch of what seems like S.H.I.E.L.D. agents who are there to help, and other scientists, but Erik is totally in charge. And he talks about the Foster theory, that we're testing out the Foster theory, which is nice because it gives us some more, attention to her science. But while they're doing this, they kind of pulls back, and there's a shot up to the roof where we've seen people before, and a quick moment where it focuses on the star at the top of the sign, and then back to Darcy and Jane, who are sitting up there. And Darcy says something like, I know he would come if he could. And Jane just kind of smiles in a I'm not worried way. And she says, but if he can't get here on his own, maybe we can help him find his way back. And then turns on what seems like a giant flashlight, but I guess it's supposed to be some kind of beacon and just putting up a flare. It's kind of like the bat signal for Thor, I think, maybe, but into the cosmos. And in the kind of mist and smoke around it, we see the outline of Yggdrasil for a moment. So I think it's supposed to be something, not just a light, but something connected to that. And then it fades out. Paul, what was your take on this deleted scene?
I mean, I think that was just the contractually obligated Skybeam at the end of movies. But it I feel like added more to the same thing that we had in the actual in the final cut, but also does kind of undermine the the Foster theory, that's cool, but then she's just hey, Thor, here's just my flashlight, come back.
For her to not even be participating in the science, but instead just up on the roof, it seems so much worse.
Right, yeah. And it's weird, though, because, when I watched the deleted scene on its own, I was kind of oh, that's nice. But then when I watched the movie and then watched the deleted scene, I was I don't know. I think maybe good choice to not include it. Although maybe they could have included her sciencing a bit more at the end. I don't know.
Yeah, it is one of those scenes where it feels, probably wise to cut this, because it creates this weird separation between, it feels like Erik and the scientists are really doing the scientific stuff. And again, it kind of fits to actually how it does end with Jane and what Heimdall says. It's what she's focused on is, I'm creating this beacon so my love can come back to me. And it's okay, but what? And she's doing that while the real scientists are downstairs. It makes it seem a little kind of unfortunate the way that it plays out. Worse, I'd say, than the way it is, but it's still one of those things.
I think it's especially worse because it doesn't involve the Heimdall and Thor voiceover. I mean, because just less Idris Elba in your movie is always bad. But also I think because, to me, part of what you get in with Thor asking about this is they're both idiot lovesick teenagers, she has all the science, but she's thinking about him. He is part of this group that is supposed to be like watching out for all of these realms, that now all of that connection's been broken and all he cares about is her. Like, at least both of them are kind of lovesick and focused on each other. And then when you take that away and it's just her, it just looks even worse.
The only thing that I do really like about this, and it's one of those little Marvel nods that we get here, it's kind of like a little Easter egg that we don't really get until much later now in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it's when we hear Erik talking to all these S.H.I.E.L.D. agents saying we're going to run another simulation using the Foster theory, this time using the S.H.I.E.L.D. astrophysical records cross-referenced with the SWORD database. And I thought that was kind of a fun little nod that we would have had a mention of SWORD so much earlier than we did otherwise.
Yeah, I think that would have had a really good effect in terms of when they did finally introduce SWORD, for it to not feel like just, to me, when they did, it felt a little bit like just, oh, another one of these organizations. But if they name dropped them in like their third or fourth movie, I feel like it would have kind of made that feel a little more smooth when they finally did introduce them. And I will say, actually, for this scene, I really enjoyed the way it was shot. The camera movement kind of coming out from the interior of the shop and then panning up to Jane and Darcy on the roof. I thought it looked really great, but in terms of actually in context of the movie, for content, I think it was a good choice to pull it.
Definitely. So then we cut to the credits, and let's talk about them. And we're going to do something for all of these minutes where we're both going to talk about the individual credits, but also just talk about credits in general, because they're obviously a very important part of the movie, but that I think a lot of film goers, myself included, have mostly just ignored for most of my movie-going life. And the MCU has, like, with the introduction of the whole, like, mid and post-credit scenes, wound up, like, having us pay a lot more attention to credits. And Paul, I know this is an issue that you've cared about for a while, that like it's important for people to watch the credits. It's always been important for you. And that when we were talking about minutes for you to come on, when I suggested these, you liked the idea of, or you may have even suggested like doing some of the credit minutes. Why is it that for you, like you think the credits are such an important thing and that you wanted to talk about them especially?
Yeah. So, I mean, my parents both worked in film, and in the film industry, a credit is like, it's where your resume comes from, basically, and people are always working to basically amass, whether it's more credits or good credits, in good productions. And when you look at the credits and you think about how long they are, right, which is one of the reasons people don't sit through them all the time, if they're not teased with some post-credit scenes, it's hard not to realize, or it helps you realize just how many people are involved in the making of a large, a big budget, or even an indie film, really, and they're long days, long weeks, they work 6-7 day weeks, like there'll be 14, 16-hour days sometimes. And just the amount of work that goes into a production, I think having some appreciation for all the work and how many people and who was there. I think there's value to that. And that was something mostly my mom instilled in me when we would go to see movies when I was a kid. We'd always sit through all the credits. Actually, somewhat humorously, when I saw Iron Man, I went with my wife, who was my girlfriend then, and she doesn't like sitting through credits. And she's like, I don't want to sit through. I'm like, all right, fine. So we left. And I didn't find out that there were post-credit scenes until actually we saw, I think, The Incredible Hulk, like we sat through and saw, the end there. And it was like, oh, that's interesting. Huh. The little cameo there. And then we'd rented Iron Man and had it playing in the other, the credits were still playing and we weren't really paying attention. And then I heard Samuel L. Jackson's voice and I was like, what? and so I was like, I should have always abided by, my mom's philosophy of watching all the credits.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it's hard to think about that, like when these movies were made, it doesn't feel like that long ago. But yeah, think about how much the internet culture has changed. That today, like if you watch a movie and don't stick around, like you're going to know if you're anywhere on social media that there's an end credit scene. Like, so the idea that you went that entire time from Iron Man to then seeing Incredible Hulk and never knew that there were those end credits is kind of, that alone is remarkable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very quick how much the time changes. Yeah.
And if you obviously, I know you obviously have been in and out of the film business for quite some time. How do you feel about like the importance of credits, and especially of Marvel kind of, making us pay more attention to them?
I mean, I've always stayed around watching credits, much to my wife's and kids' chagrins. But it's just instilled in me. I've just always, I don't know, just as somebody who wanted to work in the film industry, I wanted to kind of like get a sense of like who all these people were. And so I just started doing it probably in high school. And it just, I don't know, it just developed into a habit. And I'm like one of those people who just kind of sits there and, sometimes the cleaning crew is standing there like staring at me with their eyes like rolling, like, come on, dude, we just want to clean this thing. But it's just one of those things. I don't know. I find some peace in there listening to the music, watching the credits, and just it's time for me to also process about it. So I've always done it. And, mid and post-credit scenes, I mean, Marvel didn't invent them. They've certainly been around. I mean, I think Ferris Bueller was one of the more well-known ones.
That's the one I know most, yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, they have been around. It's just not a lot of people did them. As somebody who loved staying around for the credits, I always was thrilled when I got that little tiny nugget at the end and no one else knew about it. Mm-hmm. Like, that just always made me so happy. And now with Marvel, it's like, everybody knows, oh, well, we got to stick around. And now it's funny because it's like there's always those couple people who get up to leave and everybody's kind of scoffing at them. Wow, who are these people? They just don't know what they're doing when they come to a Marvel movie. So,
though I often have to say to them, like, wait till you get to your 40s and your back is sore and your bladder's not as good. Like, I will often like dash out, use the bathroom, come back to watch the credits.
Right.
Sure. But yeah, and I just do need to say also with the Ferris Bueller scene, it's a beautiful, great scene. It makes sticking around to the end great. But Absolutely. The whole scene is making fun of you for sticking around that long. It's like, the movie's over. Go home. Go.
Yeah, exactly.
And so here, as I think is often in not just Marvel movies, but in a lot of movies now, we should have credits with two parts, where the first, like, I grew up where the credits were literally just, the scrolling names. And now we'll often have, like, a scene of some kind that's like animation or like, moving around the world, or often it's like, animations from the movies themselves. And here what we get is it's kind of we're taking us through the cosmos and slowly realizing that we're seeing Yggdrasil. We're seeing all these different like nebulas and worlds and different realms that are part of, the allness of the Asgardians' understanding of things. And this were scenes that we're originally, as we talked about way back, that there was originally a lot more exposition of at the start of the movie and that these were the scenes we're actually going to watch. So I kind of like that they still use them. But what's kind of your reaction to seeing like this particular scene over the credits, and like how do you think the two work together?
Yeah, I really appreciate having a visual behind some of the credits. They generally do it for the bigger names, probably all the people who have points in the movie. But it does kind of set off the early parts of the credits from the later parts of the credits. It kind of, the way a striped shirt makes your dimensions look different. Like it kind of, by breaking it up, I think it helps. I'll give a Winter Soldier shout out. Like the visuals in the credits at the end there are amazing. But I think Marvel's done a really good job with this. It's not just Marvel, right? Other studios are doing similar things, but having some story kind of in there with it, I think is a good idea. I guess I didn't totally follow that as much because I was more looking at the names. So like I've conditioned myself to not notice what they're doing to try and get you to stay.
That was part of why I was asking, because I was wondering, like, does it feel like this is bringing more attention to the credits because it's or is it kind of distracting from it? Because it's like you're seeing this, you're mostly kind of watching the thing that's on the screen and the names are just kind of popping up at the sides.
Well, it's definitely like a top credits, end credits type of separation is really what it is, because like all of the stuff that is through the animation, I mean, we would have had that at the beginning with all the names still with the animation. Right. It's just, I think a lot of filmmakers over the last, number of decades have really started feeling like, we don't need to have all these credits at the top, sometimes not even having the title other than like the studio logos. And I mean, in this film, we had the studio logos. And then I think it was just like Paramount Pictures presents a Marvel Studios production or something like that. Mm-hmm. It was only that, and no, we didn't even have the title. And so they decided, let's take all of those top credits, let's cut that Heimdall. It was a big Heimdall monologue that he had about the realms and all this sort of stuff that theoretically would have been over all this, and let's just take it to the end and just get into the story. And I think that's been largely a filmmaker's thing, of just, let's just get into the story and not worry about all this stuff at the top. And so we still, as Paul said, kind of have this bifurcated set of credits with all the people who are probably getting the points and the back end deals and everything in this first part, and then everyone else just kind of shoveled in at the end. And, I don't mind it. And I do think it's actually interesting that Marvel really decided to play with that even further to create that mid-credits scene that we don't have here, but it certainly is something that's going to pop up here before long.
We're getting a little bit into like film history here, but Andy, you may know this. My vague recollection from something I think I read 20 years ago is that George Lucas was one of the first to do that. If you think about the Star Wars movies, they don't have the kind of scrolling credits during intro music that often movies at that time had. And my memory is they actually got sued for it because it was a violation of union rules at the time, which is part of why he wound up kind of independently producing some of the later movies. Andy, do you know any of these stories, or am I completely making this up by accident?
It's entirely possible. I don't have the specifics if it was actually Star Wars or some of those other kind of like in that period when filmmakers were doing that, but it is entirely possible that is right around the window when this started happening. And I mean, I get it. It's, if you want to step into a world like, in a galaxy, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, when you start seeing names that remind you, oh yeah, he's that director of American Graffiti. And that, this is that actor and that actor. It can already kind of put a wall up to kind of getting yourself set into that world.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, TV shows kind of went the same way too, where shows like Lost and Heroes would just have like the shortest intro possible. Basically, it's just the title of the show, and it's like Lost is like one note that's swelling basically, right? And then but it's like it's really right into the story. And I think it's a really good point about when you see some people's names that from other things, it's hard it can kind of take you out of particularly something that's science fiction or fantasy or some very other world. I also in like TV shows, I always found it frustrating when I'd see a special guest star and I'm like, oh, now I know that so-and-so is going to show up. Now I know that Angel is going to show up in this episode of Buffy, right? I'd rather it's surprise. Like,
the intro credits and spoilers were often very frustrating.
Exactly. But I know in movies, and I guess it's mostly just movies, not TV so much, but like having your name before the title is like a big deal. Having like an and or a with is like, that's something in a contract, right? That's someone negotiated for, and Jack Nicholson as the Joker or something, right? Or, and I think this either had with or and Anthony Hopkins as Odin.
Yes.
Right? Like that's his credit. His credit isn't Anthony Hopkins. It's Anthony Hopkins as Odin, or either with or and. And so, kind of pushing those to the end of the movie, you probably had to pay people a little bit more to kind of make this change in the, in contracts, I would imagine. Like, because, having the name in the front is like, a Kenneth Branagh film. It's like, okay, they didn't always say that, right? They didn't always have the director's name up front. And they don't always. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
So we've gone a while already, as we expected, but let's talk about some of the specific credits. Andy, what are some that particularly jumped out at you?
As we said, this is really kind of like the big names here. So we're looking at Kenneth Branagh, the screenwriters, the story producers, director of photography, production designer, editor, costume designer, visual effects, co-producer, music. So it's very much kind of like the technical people who are involved here before we really get into the cast. And I mean, I think when I look at this, you really start getting a sense. One, obviously, the Marvel team, their own Avengers team is really starting to come together by this point, and you're seeing a lot of these Marvel names that are going to kind of continue through through this franchise, and it's nice to kind of see. But then also, it's great. I mean, Kenneth Branagh. I mean, his new film Belfast is still in theaters, and Harris Zambrolokos is still his director of photography for that film. So clearly, they have had a long working relationship. Likewise, Patrick Doyle. So it's nice seeing these names that are working together here that will continue working together, through time. And I love kind of having those connections and seeing that. And then just Bo Welch production design. I mean, there's a reason that I'm so in love with like Heimdall's Observatory and the way some of the things look here, because Bo Welch, has been a production design name that you've wanted to see for a very long time. I think that the worlds that he has created, I think, are just fantastic sometimes. And so yeah, a lot of strong names in the this first part of the credits here.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of directors will have a director of photography that they work with very often, right? And clearly, Branagh and was it Zambrolokos?
Yeah,
Zambrolokos have worked together a lot on some of these new Poirot films too that I'm sort of interested to see, but no one but David Suchet will ever be my Poirot. But also a shout out.
It's all about the mustache, right?
Right, exactly. The mustache. I feel like it has to be dark. I feel like a blonde mustache. I don't know. I can't handle a blonde Poirot, but I do love Kenneth Branagh, and I'm curious to see.
Wait, Branagh's not playing Poirot, is he?
Yeah.
Branagh's playing Poirot.
I actually really liked him in Murder on the Orient Express. Again, yeah, it's this whole thing. But yeah, I'm very curious to see the next one for sure.
Yeah, I'll definitely check those out. Also, a shout out to the editor, Paul Hoppe, who worked on a lot of Michael Mann films, like The Insider, which I think The Insider. It's like a 2.5 hour movie that went by super fast to me. And some of that's the gripping performances. There's a lot to that, but you can't get a 2.5 hour movie to not feel like a drag without fantastic editing. And I think the editing can really, I think people underestimate it. How much my mom was a film editor, so I've heard a lot over the years. I kind of grew up in an editing room at points in time, but just how much the editing has to do with getting the most out of the performances, like not just like which takes do you use, but like exactly how it's cut. And so I feel like this movie really does flow very well. And, didn't have to. Like, it could have had an extra 5 minutes or 5 minutes less and not worked as well. And, in terms of that one scene, like, was it the editor who decided to cut it? Was it Branagh? Was it Feige? Like, we don't know. Well, maybe we do know. Maybe I don't know. But often that will be, I think sometimes we talk about people who get too successfur to be edited at some point, right?
George Lucas, who we brought up before, being a...
Sure. Maybe like a George R.R. Martin or a J.K. Rowling or whatever, like, and then they kind of just get to make it however they wanted. And there's something to be said for like the auteur's vision or whatever. But like often a good editor can kind of be like, okay, if we just, rein this in here, maybe we'll get more out of what what you're putting into it, as opposed to trying to squeeze every last thing into it. Sometimes less is more.
And on a different note, on the Superhero Ethics podcast, by the time this goes out, it'll be a couple months ago, but we did an episode on the movie Jaws, and a lot of what we talked about was the editing job that Verna Fields did, which you two may know more than I do, but as I understand it, like in film schools now, like they use that movie as like an example of like how important film editing is because of how well it's edited and that kind of thing.
She's definitely one of the big editors out there. So yeah,
the credit that jumped out at me is, and I've talked to him before, but I want to kind of, it's the last time we'll see him, so mention it. J. Michael Straczynski, one of the writers, he's probably my favorite Hollywood writer right now. Babylon 5, I think, is just very cheesy, very campy, made in the 90s, and it really shows. But it was the first show, at least one of the first, where when he sat down to write episode 1, he already knew everything that was going to happen by the last episode of season 5. And he's written a lot of other great stuff. He's very involved with Sense8, which is a show a lot of people love. And I believe he was a Thor comic book writer for a while. And just, we've talked a lot about the great writing and some of the weak writing. And I would put that on him as well, although he had a co-writer. But just every time I was seeing his name and actually getting to see him in person in the movie, it was just... I didn't know that about this movie until we really went through this minute by minute analysis. And so just seeing his name on the credits again just kind of made me happy.
It's, we talked about him back when he had his brief little cameo, and it was right at a moment where you lost internet or something, and so you didn't even get to talk on that episode.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
When he made his appearance. So I'm glad that you get to give him a little shout out. J. Michael Straczynski, obviously, has had quite a career, and it is kind of fun. I mean, it was great that he had that little cameo in here and has done a lot of stuff. Not a lot of screenwriting for feature films, but as you pointed out, it's really kind of like the TV world that he does his stuff. But yeah, his comic line, I think that's largely why he ended up kind of helping develop the story here, because his is the one where, post Ragnarok, Thor, settles in Oklahoma as Donald Blake, and then has to kind of figure out how to get himself back and everything. And
which we were talking about with Will last week.
Right. Yeah. Because Asgard is that giant floating city, right above Oklahoma.
And just last shout out for him. As I said, a lot of the complaints that people have about Babylon 5 is a very low budget for the time, low effects, and the studio interfered a lot with his vision of it. He has now gotten a green light. I believe they're starting production to a remake of Babylon 5, where he's not going to have those kind of limitations. So, end of my JMS prompts. But yeah, for either of you, probably a good time to wrap up. But any other last credit you want to mention and bring up?
I did just want to mention real quick, which ones have done other Marvel projects since. So I'll try to go through this pretty quick. Ashley Miller and Zach Stentz, who were co-screenwriters. Just as a note with screenwriting, you can have an ampersand and between writers, or an A&D and between writers. If it's an ampersand, that means they actually wrote together. And then if it's A&D, that means that person wrote separately as kind of coming on and doing a rewrite. So Ashley Miller and Zach Stentz actually collaborated together to write. They actually worked on X-Men First Class together, working on that script. And I just have to say, I'm a little horrified, though, to bring up, and I just don't want this to actually ever happen. But it has been announced that they are working on the remake of Big Trouble in Little China.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
my heart's a little broken that has somebody's been talking about that. So
it's one of those movies that is such a classic that I don't want to see people redo. It also hasn't aged that well in a lot of ways. So
hey, bite your tongue, mister. I love that movie so much. Okay, sure. I'll acknowledge it might be my young eyes still pining for that movie, but yeah.
I love Ghostbusters, but the Bill Murray romance, not so much.
Oh, no. Well, yeah, there's not quite as much. I mean, there's still, arranged marriages and stuff, but it's, I don't know. It's not Ghostbusters level.
I haven't seen Big Trouble in Little China in a minute, but I think the prospects of a remake are somewhat frightening.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Who knows?
Well, if there's one person out in Hollywood who loves getting stuff remade just because of all the extra coins in his pocket, it certainly is John Carpenter. So I'm not that surprised, really. Okay, so Don Payne, the other writer, did the, I don't know if he should be proud of it or not, but the Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer movie, and then also did the story for Thor: The Dark World. So that's his little touch in Marvel.
Not two highlights of a career, but good things on a resume nonetheless.
Paychecks.
Yeah,
paychecks.
It's something. And then we have of the people who have worked on in this chunk of the credits, the only other one other than the Marvel people, I'm not digging into like Kevin Feige and those names, because guess what? They have been involved in them.
Yeah.
But Alexandra Byrne, who did the costume designs for this film, and she has worked a lot with Branagh over the years, but she did this, she did the Avengers, she did Guardians of the Galaxy, Avengers Age of Ultron, Doctor Strange, and is working on The Flash right now. So she has done a lot of other Marvel and other comic book movies.
And I think the kind of dog that didn't bark there that's worth commenting on is that the person we're not saying who went on to do more stuff with Marvel is Kenneth Branagh. Because like, he was trying to set the tone for Thor. And it's interesting because we've spent this whole movie talking about how much we love the Shakespearean tone. But also I think it's pretty widely acknowledged, and I would agree with it, that Thor really comes into his own in Avengers and then Ragnarok and other things like that, where they kind of get away from it somewhat.
It's
do either of you know, were there ever plans for Branagh to do more Thor and he decided not to, or was he always going to be one and done?
I would imagine that he would have liked to continue. I just don't know. I haven't heard anything about it. I'm going to have to do some digging before we get to Thor: The Dark World, and try to get a sense. Like, did he just not like the script for that movie and so chose to not do it, or was he even asked? Like, I don't know. Like, because I think there is a sense that Thor, it's not like not many people consider it like one of the top tier films of the MCU. So to that end, it's fairly middling, even though it did kind of open the cosmos for the storytelling and largely, I think, made people feel more comfortable with what Marvel was going to be doing. But still, I think there is a thing about Thor that people are like, yeah, it's there. So I don't know.
I'll admit, I was somewhat in that camp before we did this like deep analysis of it. So
yeah.
I don't know. I thought that Thor basically set out what it needed to do. Set out and did what it needed to do in a way that I didn't really expect. I was at the time very skeptical that they were going to be able to take this movie and work as well as it did. And on this rewatch, I found a lot of the Asgard stuff less compelling than in the first few viewings, but I found a lot of the Earth stuff more compelling. Like just the Scientists 3, I just really enjoyed their dynamic, and then their dynamic with Thor.
I do have to ask, how much of that is having seen Darcy in WandaVision and just kind of loving Darcy all the more because of that?
I mean, Darcy, honestly, like, I'll watch Kat Dennings in anything. So,
yeah,
like, she was one of the reasons that I liked this, and she's one of the reasons that Thor: The Dark World isn't, like, my least favorite Marvel movie. And that was basically when she and Randall Park showed up in WandaVision. That was when I actually liked WandaVision. I was like, oh, okay, I can get on board with this show. But like, I guess I could do with a lot more of the side characters a lot of the time. I don't know. But yeah, here I think it would have been a valid choice to see the script or the story for Thor: The Dark World and be like, maybe I'll go do some Poirot. I don't know.
Yeah.
But here, there's 5 people involved in the writing of this movie, aside from whatever producer notes and whatever else was going on. There's also Mark Protasevich, the story. So there's 2 people writing a story, and then 3 people writing a screenplay from that. Although 2 of them as a team, so maybe that was in iterations. I don't know the details on that, but often I think that can be a bad sign that something had a lot of rewrites or that there's kind of like too many cooks in the kitchen. I remember being really surprised with Spider-Man: Homecoming, just seeing how many writing credits there were and how good I thought the movie was anyway. I think Marvel's done a really good job overall of like having movies feel like they have continuity, even when there are really a lot of people involved in the writing. I think that's very hard to do, but they've done it well.
And I know that during phase 2, the story that was often going around was that a lot of kind of top-level directors were not interested in working with Feige or with MCU because they felt like they were being too shoehorned into like doing things that fit the MCU overall story instead of the stories they wanted told. And, it was probably Joe from the internet on TikTok and Twitter that told me this, so take it with massive grains of salt. But I think part of the story that I remember is that Branagh is often cited as one of the directors who like got scared away because of the MCUing too hard. And I definitely think Phase 2 was a time when there was a lot of pushing of the larger narrative into the individual movies. Whether Branagh was actually caught up in that, that may be just pure speculation, but I know it was one of the stories going around at the time.
Well, certainly, the whole Edgar Wright story with Ant-Man, I think was, exactly to the point that you're making is like, those are the stories that people were hearing. They were like, oh, maybe I don't want to work with them if they're not going to let me tell the story I want to tell. Which,
Ant-Man, I think, turned out to be a wonderful movie, but not everyone agrees.
I do too.
Anyway, so Paul, for people who are discovering you for the first time on this episode, what's ZenMadman?
Yeah, that's an alias I came up with about 13 years ago or so. I do mostly poker content, but I also write some fiction. I've got music that I made some time ago. I do some streaming. You can find me on Twitter as ZenMadman, on Twitch as ZenMadman, on YouTube as well, although mostly I have ZenMadman Poker there. And I'm maybe going to have a podcast soon of my own, maybe by the time this comes out, which will be just a bunch of fiction called ZenMadman Presents.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah, I obviously, I've been friends for decades. I've read a lot of your fiction. It's really good. There's some stories based in New York City that have nothing to do with any things I've ever lived through. But yeah, definitely a lot of stuff worth reading. Check Paul out on Twitch and all those other places. And of course, if you go to theethicalpanda.com, that's where you'll find my podcast, which you'll find Paul is a frequent guest on both Superhero Ethics and The Ethical Panda. And of course, if you like podcasts like this, you should check out all the other seasons of Marvel Movie Minute, as well as a lot of other great movie content, all of which is on the Next Reel family of podcasts. So I'm myself, Paul, Andy. Thank you all for being listeners. Thank you all for being great fans, and have a great day.
Until next time, true believers.
Marvel Movie Minute is a production of True Story FM, engineering by Andy Nelson. This season's music is One Last Ride by Martin Puringer. Find the show at truestory.fm. And if your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, consider doing that for this show.